Hello, tiny humans. It's so good to see you. Today's book is a special request from Zoe L. Do you have a special request? Type it below in the comments. I'm sure I can find it at my local library and I can read it and dedicate it to you too. It's called Don't Be Silly, Mrs. Millie. Our author, the person who wrote it, is Judy Cox. The illustrator, the person who drew the pictures, is Joe Mateo. Do you ever mix up your words? Well, Mrs. Millie does it a lot, and she is silly. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Every day she says, "Good morning, children. Please hang up your goats." Goats? What do you think she was trying to say? Coats. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our coats. At 8 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Please rise for the frog salute." "Oh no," we shout. "You mean the flag salute." Silly Mrs. Millie. It's 9 o'clock. Time to write. Mrs. Millie says, "Get out your paper and penguins." What does she mean? I think you're right. "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our paper and pencils." At 10 o'clock at recess time, our teacher looks out the window. "It's just stopped raining cats and dogs. Don't step in a poodle." A poodle? "Don't you mean a puddle?" we ask, giggling. We play outside until our teacher blows her whistle. "Recess is over," she yells. "It's time to chameleon." Chameleon? Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean it's time to come in. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Millie says, "You may get drinks, but don't cut in the lion." "You mean line," we yell. Yikes. At 12 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Time for lunch. Wash your hands with soap and walrus." "You're silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean soap and water." As we get in line, Mrs. Millie reminds us, "Don't forget your lunch bunny." Lunch bunny. "Oh, that's right, our lunch money," we shout. Mrs. Millie puts on her glasses to read the menu. "They have gorilla cheese sandwiches today." Gorilla cheese? Oh, I think you're right. "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean grilled cheese sandwiches." At 1 o'clock, our teacher picks up a book. "It's story time. Sit on the..." What did Miss Millie say? She said bug. "Sit on the bug." "You're so silly," we say. "You mean sit on the rug." They do rhyme though, rug, bug. At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Millie calls us to the back of the room. "It's time for art. Who wants to paint on the weasel?" The weasel? "You mean that easel, Mrs. Millie. How can you be so silly?" we ask. After art, our teacher asks, "Who's hungry? We have parrot sticks and quackers." Quack, quack. "We know what you mean. Carrot sticks and crackers," we yell. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Millie smiles. "What a fun day we've had. But it's time to go home. Put on your bats and kittens." Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our hats and mittens. When we're ready to leave, our teacher goes to the door. Butterfly, children! No, Mrs. Millie, we shout. You don't mean butterfly, you mean goodbye. Mrs. Millie laughs. We laugh too. Butterfly, Mrs. Millie. See you later. And we wave goodbye as we get on the octopus. What a great story. Thank you, Zoe L, for requesting that. As I said before, leave your requests down below and I'm more than happy to dedicate a book to you. Have a wonderful day, tiny humans. And don't forget, being kind is cool.